Oh, I think we're there. Are we good? We're good. It seemed to go frozen. Can you hear me? I can't hear you right now.
Can you hear me now? Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we can hear each other. That's good. I'm just going to outside the room towards the window and see what's outside. Maybe they'll want to look in the room. It's quite a nice thing to look with that movement of the neck from one shoulder over to the other. You're bringing your chin across. And you may have noticed that you actually stopped somewhere along the way, or you hesitated, or you blinked, or something caught your attention in a way. Just be curious and go back to that place that caught your attention. Was it a movement? Was it an object? A color, shape, texture? You see what happens as you look at it and describe to yourself what it is you're looking at. So you're taking a moment to bring focus to what it is you're looking at. And as you do that, you're also bringing your curiosity to it. You may have noticed that this associative thinking is clicking in and it's elaborating and expanding itself. And then begin to notice yourself, your body, experience of that. What's happened? Has anything shifted or changed in that little tiny engagement? Maybe your breath is different. Maybe you've dropped your shoulders, or you're sitting more comfortably in the seat. Just taking the time to notice. And what I'd like to do is just pay attention to that little difference that may be there between when you started the exercise, before we wandered out, that condition you found yourself in this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are now, and noticing the just noticeable difference. Now, Fechner, who preceded Freud, was the person who wrote this paper on the just noticeable difference, and he was a neurologist before the birth of modern day neurology. And he was fascinated that the just noticeable difference itself creates a new pathway, we would say nowadays, the possibility for something new to happen. And as we begin to pay attention to that, to bring our attention to the just noticeable difference, then that expands in itself. That's sort of like the physiology of it. So in doing that, you may also have noticed that relaxation or that ease that was coming into the body begins to have a life of its own. It actually augments. Just paying attention to yourself again and noticing it. So what I'm doing with this is I'm teaching you also something about tracking your inner experience. It's very, very important, learning the skill of tracking and paying attention to our inner experience on the very basic biological level. What is happening? And what supports us in doing the exercise of orienting is the right hemisphere. Now, McGilchrist's book is wonderful in his description of the right hemisphere. And I feel it's really great to bring it in relation to this exercise, because he's saying that the capacity of the right brain for curiosity is inexhaustible. So if you're sitting with a client and you think, oh my God, they've looked at that long enough and I don't know what's happening, or they've told me that they see this or that and that's it, and your anxiety is bringing in closure or foreclosure, if you can sit back into the realization, we're actually in the realm of the right hemisphere, and it could go on and on and on. And we could spend the whole time just talking and feeling into this experience, this amplification that happens naturally when we engage the right hemisphere. It's associative thinking. So that's something that I'm just saying as an encouragement when you're engaging with this process of coming into the body, of coming into what we call nowadays the here and now moment. And the here and now of our physiology is really what gives us great grounding. Being able to experience the felt sense of that, what's the resonance in the body for the experience? Is it the shoulders, or is it a softer gut? Or is it suddenly I feel energy in a part of my body that was quite frozen before now? Or that I'm more alive? Whatever it is, that engagement in a way is what we're looking for. Just noticing the just noticeable difference. And I'm speaking and beginning that today as the base for giving you an opening, as it were, into the conversation I would like to have with you around attachment and attunement. Dan Siegel talks about inner attunement and outer attunement being so connected. Something like 9 out of the 10 pathways that we use for outer attunement, 9 of them are already engaged in inner attunement. So by oiling those wires, as it were, by visiting them and becoming practiced with our own inner attunement, we are in fact serving our capacity for outer attunement. So there is no tension, as it were, between them, but rather one complements the other. I like to think about it in that way because for me, it's also the basis of what I experience as building a secure base. Now, in the early work around attachment work, Bowlby and Ainsworth, Mary Ainsworth was one of his prodigies in a way, worked with him and then developed and took it further in basically looking at and breaking down what the different attachment styles were, behavioral patterns and attachment styles. Simply put, a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. And they brought psychotherapy, if you like, and psychoanalysis in particular, into the here and now, because they were taking it out of the realm of just being in the complex or the psyche, where Klein would say the inner figures, those internal images or imagos, are operating and controlling us. And Bowlby was watching children, particularly around the post-war time, and looking at their attachment styles as they responded to being left or put into nursery care or further away when they were sent away during war times out of the city of London into the safety of the country. And all of the studies that went on then were about here and now studies. And so it was a big shift to realize it's happening in the here and now. And what we now also know is that here and now happening of the patterns are actually have their basis neurologically in the wiring, and that the wiring is encoded from the earliest times, as I said yesterday, the earliest attachment relationship. Our embryology is already visited by the environment in which it grows, whether it's a safe environment or an unsafe environment, nurturing or not. And so we are capable then, we would say, of creating a learned, secure attachment. That was the big shift in the work. From the attachment, insecure attachments, we can create the environment for a learned, secure attachment. what I would suggest is, in doing the work rooted in the body, that we build that learned, secure attachment in the body, to the body, held in the body, contained in the body, in the larger context of and being midwifed by the therapist. So that we often think of therapy as the container. In this instance, I'm saying yes, therapy is the container, but the actual body container that is me, body and mind, is and has the capacity to ground me and make me, in a sense, more connected to myself, both to the small s and to the bigger S. So a lot of our work in my training was all about building that in the transference relationship. And I think that is really important, the transference relationship. And for me, the transference relationship is always mirroring the early attachment. At some level, that same patterning will come up. Those default positions of fight, flight, or freeze will be triggering the particular behavior. And I am, in my work, really very focused and very devoted to the idea that we can build a secure attachment through the body. By paying attention to our body, we begin in some ways to fall in love with the body. Just as the mother, when paying attention to her child, produces oxytocin, when we pay attention to our own body cells and the resonances in the body, we develop this relationship which creates more and more positive oxytocin and positive chemicals in our body, building a secure base. Much of our work is about creating a core sense of self. Again, my hypothesis is, in working with the body, we create the capacity for a secure base in myself, in my embodied self. We talked yesterday about increasing capacity for emotion. And in the chapter that I sent you to read, Spinoza is talking about reason-induced emotion, that we counteract overwhelm, if you like, or a lot of negative affect by reason-induced emotion. Now, if you take that image I showed yesterday of the triune brain, and just remembering and reminding you that the thumb is like the amygdala, and when it's triggered, when it realizes and picks up that it's an unsafe environment, then the message goes into the midbrain or the emotional brain. It tells then the reptilian or older brain how it should act, fight or flight or freeze. But we have this neocortex, this front part of our brain, all of this part of the brain that can reason with the midbrain. It can say, as I said yesterday, no, that's not a snake, that's just a rope that's coiled. From our earliest time, the amygdala is firing, we said in the last trimester in the womb. And so when we're born, that connection to the midbrain is firing. But we also know that the neocortex is not online yet. It takes about 10 months before this orbital frontal cortex connects in with the midbrain. And when that starts to connect, it's through the senses that the information is coming. So this is a very powerful piece for us to remember, that the mother's voice, we talked about yesterday, the prosody in her voice, the rhythm of her voice, the sound of her voice, her contact with her eyes, her picking up the auditory cues from the baby, her smell, all of these act as, if you like, a kind of a neocortex, what we call an auxiliary cortex, to calm the baby and bring that in. And as the time goes on, this frontal cortex develops and has the capacity itself to reason and bring in reason. It takes about 3 years before, the first 3 years before this whole frontal cortex is operational fully, with the hippocampus coming on and memory shifting out of this. First memories are all bodily memories, mostly in the right hemisphere, all in the right hemisphere to begin with, which is also a very important part of all our work, to know that early memory is not in episodal memory where you can pick up this happened and then that happened and this happened. No, it sits right deep into the body, and very often can only be contacted when we have a certain degree of safety, where the body can feel safe and those autonomic gestures and sounds can come out. I would parallel this here with Levine's piece around trauma, that trauma is something that's been interrupted, a self-protective mechanism that was interrupted. So if you think of a child about to fall, they'll put their hands out like that. And if they miss that safety device, if, for instance, they fell before they had time to protect themselves or save themselves, then this is an incomplete gesture. It's frozen in the body, and that in itself can cause a trauma. A physical accident like that can cause trauma to the body because there's something incomplete, and so it blocks, and there's a blockage. There's a sense in the whole system that something has got arrested. The memory of this, if it happens when it's very young, is in the body. It's held in the body. And so how we approach the body is by building connection. And again, one of my teachers, Marian Woodman's co-facilitator, Mary Hamilton, and creator of Body Soul Rhythms with Marian, Mary used to say to us, it's cell by cell. How do we make relationship to ourselves except through cell by cell? So eros is right there. Often when we're talking about neuroscience, people think it's mechanical, but it's actually hugely about our capacity for eros, for love and attention. One of the poems I really love by Rumi, I'm going to say it to you now just to let it sink in and see how it holds as a metaphor for what I'm speaking about. How did the rose ever open her heart and reveal to the world all of her beauty? How did the rose ever open her heart and reveal to the world all of her beauty? She felt the encouragement of light upon her being. Otherwise, we all remain too frightened. And I think that's what I'm talking about around eros, the encouragement of light. It's not drowning something in light. It's not overwhelming something with microscopic detail of focus. It's a very soft, obtuse light. Again, Marian Woodman used to talk to us about the feminine, and its ways are not linear or direct. They're obtuse, they're spiraling, and it's a soft, more like a moonlight. In the same way, when we approach the body, we're listening, we're gentle. We're noticing where the activation is, as we say. We're noticing where somebody feels stirred and the resonance of that in the body. But we don't go after it. In fact, you go in the opposite direction, like Spinoza says. Reason-induced emotion. Reason in this case being choice. We exercise choice and we move away from the activation towards a resource. We look outside. Where are we drawn? And we're often drawn to something that's a perfect antidote for what has caught us in its grip. In Jungian terms, we might say, for the complex that's activated. Often the image outside, when we elaborate and stay in the conversation and amplify it, can often have incredible meaning to balance up this place of activation. And when we're just in discussion with it, it's not enough to stay outside looking at it. We've got to bring it into the body by noticing, not examining, but just where do you notice that in your body when you're talking about that image that's just drawn you there? And I invite all of you now to take a moment to go back to what you oriented to at the beginning. When you looked at that then, how you felt. And now look back at it again. Just take a moment to check in with yourself and look at this object and see what it is that you were looking at and how does it appear now. And as you do so, see how you feel in your body. What's the resonance at this moment with your object, with what has drawn you? And again, it's the resonance in the body. Notice that in the body. Notice where it has a resonance. And then feel into the rest of your body. So again, it's just not, we're not holding it to a tiny part of the body. Like it might be that your throat feels more at ease or not tight. So just noticing the throat might be easier. But then see how the rest of the body is doing. So you're always inviting in the fluidity. Nothing gets stayed or tight. It's like opening it to feel all the time we're in a connective flow. Something is coming in and something is going out. We were talking about that yesterday in terms of activation or deactivation. I want to talk a little bit yesterday. I think it might have been Richard who asked the question about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And I said I would deal with that today. We will be looking at that a little bit. And I just would like to say that as we're speaking now, where I'm really focused in is in terms of evolutionary biology. We're looking at the social engagement system. We're looking at what our eyes and ears and throat maybe, and even voice if we were speaking, how we're engaging those, that architecture, if you like, of the social engagement system. And I'm asking you to reflect when we engage that architecture on what its effect is on your heart and on your lungs. I don't ask those questions. I say, just notice what's happening, because I know the engagement is, this, we call it the social engagement system, is directly influencing our ventral system, the vagus nerve. And it has the capacity to soothe and to settle an activated ventral system. It's in fact the latest phylogenetically. The mother just can soothe shh, 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 very quietly. We have a fight, flight response, which is really quick. It comes in absolutely very fast. And we call that, it's a myelinated system, which means it's the response is really immediate. But the social engagement system can come in and override it and calm down. Now, the older system in the body, the reptilian system, is part of the vagus nerve, and it's called the dorsal vagus. And that's responsible for the freeze response. And the freeze response is deep down there in the belly, where people can often feel blocked, frozen, stuck. Many of us can spend a lifetime in freeze and not even know it, because it is really old and really primitive. And as I said, memory doesn't go back all that far in terms of thinking memory. It's a body response that may have happened very, very early on. And that freeze, we too have to pay attention to. We may get distracted with our clients that they're always in fight flight, but it was a huge revelation for me to realize that fight flight can often disguise the freeze that's underneath, which often in psychological terms we might even call a depression. But in the physiology, it's a freeze. With COVID, many people have found themselves isolated. Many people have felt very depressed by that or highly anxious. I'd like to just tell the story of working with somebody who was speaking to her isolation, and was feeling really quite numbed out, was the phrase that she used. And I noticed that there was a movement she was making with her hand. And I often, if I'm seeing something that's being repeated, I might often just notice that your hand is doing that. And what happens when you do that? I'm just curious to know, is it something that soothes you a little bit? No, I'm dead. There's no meaning to it, no affect, nothing. It's just a deadness that's there. So I really felt then we were dropping into that dead place. And I was curious about it. Okay, we're going into a freeze. And so she sat and noticed what's happening in the rest of her body. And the freeze became stronger and stronger. And the time took on its own life. Now, in this work, I can say to you that the time is really important. The encouragement of light upon her being for the rose isn't 2 minutes. It's really giving the body time. And so the freeze was coming in, and I was just with the freeze and asking every now and then, what do you notice? What's happening? And after a while, I saw the hand come to the side of the face. And I was curious about it. And in fact, she had almost no sense that her hand was there at all. Nothing. I can feel nothing. I thought, okay, we're definitely in very early stuff here. Something has just knocked her out. The sensation was even gone. And we stayed further with it. So my voice is like the regulator. It keeps her in touch. So there's an inner attunement that's happening with her, but she's hearing my voice. That social engagement is just enough to keep her heart beating and not letting her go out altogether. So after a while, I said, is anything happening? Because I could see that something was changing a little bit. There was just a little bit of breath moving. And I could see that the little finger was slightly moving. And I said, what's happening? And she said, I think something's happening in my little finger. And I said, well, what's happening? I think it's reaching. It's reaching for something. And it's like we were just stirring that beginning of life, reaching for connection. And what happens if you follow that? And slowly she began to put her hands very slowly towards the cheek, the same cheek that had been dead earlier, and just very slowly touching. And my job really was just to be witness to it and help her to stay as witness to herself, to stay present to what was happening. What does it feel like when you do that? What are you noticing? And when we ask those questions, we leave lots of time for the answer, because the system is really, really primitive. And to rush it would bring in, well, will actually just overwhelm it, and it'll shut down again. So the encouragement of light needs lots of time. I think we might have to leave it there. If I'm looking at the time right now.
Hard to shift from that piece. It's so beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Robin. Yeah. Yeah.
But in making this shift, we have a little over 10 minutes. And so this is the time where any of you could ask a question either through the chat icon at the bottom of your screen or Q&A. If you do so now, that would be great. And I'll give you a few seconds. But I will start with a question that came to me around talking about the transference, how important that is to you, and indirectly you answered that in your various case examples. But if you would say more about what sometimes called as the countertransference, like how your own body informs you of how to be so exquisitely present for the other being that you're witnessing.
Yes, Robin. Yeah, in the book, I often speak to the countertransference in terms of how I was reading myself in a situation, and very often how I may have reacted in a way that was not appropriate. And people often comment in the book and say, that's what I liked in your transcripts, that you were able to comment like that. I think really what's key is the inner attunement. So it's not about getting it perfect. In fact, if we're really working with transference, we are going to be replicating the misattunement. So it's continually about this, like as Tronic says, it's the rupture and repair. And so I have to be attuned enough to know that I have reenacted perhaps a transference, an early transference. And I have to know that in myself. So I'm picking it up at all different levels. I'd be picking up how I'm feeling in myself. It may be that it's giving me a lot of information, my body, about what's going on right now. I may be very uncomfortable with the situation and think, okay, I've really stirred something here or reenacted something. Or I may be feeling something, as we know, by projective identification that was intolerable for the client herself or himself to feel. And so in that moment, in my countertransference, I'm realizing I'm holding something here that it's not yet okay for that person to hold. But I can always bring in for the person what's happening right now, because we don't want them in the projective identification to dissociate. It's always to bring back into the here and now. What's happening now? What are you noticing now? So I may be noticing a lot going on for me, and I may notice they're quite dissociated. So I will invite them back into the present here and now. I might say, this is a moment for us to orient. Let's take a time to orient around the room again and see it as a kind of a threshold moment where I can realign them with their own self in that moment. Doesn't mean I'll be handing back what I'm carrying, because it may not be a time for that, but that they have their own taproot to their own experiencing self.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you. We have a question. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Punita. Dear Marian, could you please talk about the mirroring via Zoom? Do you feel that the virtual connection has changed your perception, connection with the client? Many thanks.
Do I feel that the virtual connection has changed my...
And do you feel that the virtual connection has changed your perception / connection with the client? Like working on...
Yeah, no, I'm getting it. Punita, thank you for your question. Firstly, I've been working a long time online, so this just didn't come in this year to me. And in fact, many of the Yeah, when I moved to Zurich a good number of years ago now for a while, just to write and focus. And I took some of my long-standing clients with me and we moved on to Zoom. And what I found is because I was tracking the body all the time, and because I was doing exactly what I've been teaching you guys just now, I, 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 I didn't feel the lack. I really feel huge shifts are happening when we give the authority back to the person and we make their own resonating body, when we bring it more alive to them, when we build connection with it. And then that I'm my witnessing self, I'm a guide, I'm a mirror. I love you brought in that word mirror. As you can see in the book, I do a huge amount of mirroring. But I'm really working with the detail. I'm never far away from the body's resonance. So I always feel really present with the person. So thank you for that question. And I feel really being embodied in this way and helping to grow the secure base in the body works very well online. Thank you, Punita.
So question 2 from Eileen. Marian issued a lovely invitation to us to notice what is happening in our bodies. For some people who have experienced early trauma, being in their body may be terrifying and trigger fight, flight, or freeze in the present. Can Marian say a bit more about helping the person who finds being in their body very difficult or terrifying?
Yeah. Okay, that's a really important question. Who is that person? I didn't hear.
Eileen.
Eileen. Okay. So I think that is a very important question. You heard me say cell by cell. Another word is drop by drop. Levine brought in the phrase, we titrate. So we don't drop people into the body. And then, as Eileen has just said, you can have overwhelm and it's just too much for somebody. So we're doing it drop by drop by drop. And we do it drop by drop by pendulating between the symptom, for instance, or the complex, you could say, and then orienting outward to a resource that's outside, that's calling our attention, or that may be in the imagination. That these two things working together and between each other can bring in that sense of drop by drop. I had one story just to bring in on this one. A client that I worked with, I had trained in SE at this point, and it was quite novel in Ireland at that stage. And somebody said to me they'd been working with somebody for a long time, but they felt really stuck. This person hadn't been able to conceive and was very depressed, and yet was, quite had a very rich life, and that there was no reason why she shouldn't be conceiving. So we met, and in the very first session, I noticed there was an action happening, and she was just rubbing her finger a little bit. And so very gently, again, encouragement of light, just very gently I said, when you're doing that, what are you noticing? And she said, what am I doing? That. I said, well, just slow it down and see what happens when you do it. So I brought my curiosity into it. She said, yeah, it's quite nice. It's quite nice. Now, that was like the first drop or invitation to the body. And I knew from her early history, we'd already taken the history, that she had had a lot of surgery, and she was on traction for almost, on and off for 18 months of her life. So her hips were, she had dysplasia. And so the body was a place of such torture. In fact, her dream images were very, very disturbing, very disturbing. In fact, if you didn't know about trauma, you think she'd been abused. And I always felt, no, this is actually the image we put on something for something that was so physically harming and damaging. I mean, it was healing her, but it was evoking such trauma in her body that, as Levine says, we image it in the vernacular. And so for her, it was like an abuse on the body. But here we are, drop by drop, and I'm saying, what do you notice? So next week she comes back in and she said, I was at my meeting this week and things were getting really hot. So I just started very gently to bring my attention to my finger and feel comfort. And so we laughed about it and we engaged with it and what does it feel like? And it was, if you could say in some ways, superficial. I felt happier. And how do you know you're happy? Oh, I was smiling to myself. So here we are, we're in the body. So that's all in the body. These are all telling us about the body. And then slowly, and what happens when you smile? What do you notice? Well, I get a little bit easier and gentle. And so bit by bit, we moved from the fingers to the toes. And again, the body brought us there. We didn't invite the toes in. The body brought us there. She started to tell me that she had a thing about toes, and she could hardly bear to look at her feet. In fact, she would never look at her feet in a mirror. And then slowly, we began the relationship with the toes. And over time, she'd come in and she'd say, you know what? I bought all these socks. I'm completely into socks. And then she had themes for her socks. And then she started to draw her feet. But slowly, the layers came up. And then the forgotten, we could say, or the implicit memory started to come through. And we were working and healing the early trauma in the body. But we had such a safe place now to work it from. So that's my response to Eileen.
Thank you. There's one last comment from Richard. I'll read the comment and then he has a question the question is, how can we contact you for further knowledge of your work? I'll leave that, and then I'll leave the longer comment from Richard. Thank you, Marian. Such a beautiful case example. Your soft, enduring attention to the client, waiting for the light and life to return brings me to awareness in my own practice of how I bring the ways of mindfulness to each moment, but the tenderness and compassion for the client, but with tenderness and compassion for the client. And in the countertransference, the light and compassion of the moment within myself. The realignment seems to happen with coming back to the body almost meditatively. Thank you.
That's lovely. It is coming back to the body. And when he uses the word, Richard, when you use the word meditatively, it's like autonomic is what they would say. So it's not, I'm inviting back to the body. I'm allowing the body to bring something, to bring me somewhere, or to deepen what's experienced and what hasn't yet come up, like this woman's early trauma came back up. And again, it's the titration each time. So we don't land on something, we titrate it, we just allow it the space. And that little finger begins to reach for the contact. I like to go back to Jung and Eros, the principle of Eros.
We are at time, and I will. Richard also asked how you could perhaps give me this information, how he could or others could reach you for further information.
Well, at the moment, my website and my email address. We can give my email address as well at the end of this, perhaps.
All right, very good. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we've come to a close, and goodbye. Thank you for attending today, and we'll see some of you, or if not all of you, tomorrow. Thank you, Marian.
Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.